September 2019. On a rural road in Georgia, a minivan had left the pavement and struck a culvert. When Deputy Wade Bennett arrived, the driver was still there. His name was Michael Wayne Jones. At first, it appeared to be a traffic accident. Then Bennett moved closer and noticed an odor coming from the damaged vehicle, one he recognized as decomposition. When the deputy asked why Jones was in Georgia, Jones gave an answer that changed everything. He said his wife, Casei Jones, was dead inside the van and admitted that he had killed her. Bennett immediately asked about the children: Cameron Bowers, Preston Bowers, Mercalli Jones, and Iona Jones. Jones claimed all four were safe with their grandmother. That statement gave officers one urgent fact to verify. But the children were not with their grandmother. And the woman concealed inside the wrecked minivan was only the first discovery in a case that would lead investigators across state lines, through weeks of false messages, and into a wooded area where the rest of the family had been left. By the time Deputy Wade Bennett reached the wrecked minivan in Georgia, 5 members of one Florida family had already been missing for weeks. They were 32-year-old Casei Jones and her 4 children, 9-year-old Cameron Bowers, 4-year-old Preston Bowers, 2-year-old Mercalli Jones, and 11-month-old Iona Jones. Cameron and Preston were Casei's sons from a previous marriage. Mercalli and Iona were the daughters she shared with Michael Wayne Jones. Relatives had not seen Casei or the children, and normal contact had stopped. Yet messages continued to arrive in Casei's name. Texts and social media communications appeared to explain where she was and why the family remained away. But those messages could not answer the question her relatives were beginning to ask. Why could no one speak directly with Casei or confirm that the children were safe? What began as concern over irregular communication would soon become a search for an entire family. The investigation would uncover a killing inside a Summerfield home, weeks of messages written in Casei's name, a false sighting reported to police, 5 victims concealed from view, and a journey that ended only when Michael Jones's minivan crashed beside a Georgia road. By then, investigators still knew only a fraction of what had happened. Before this case became associated with a crashed minivan, false messages, and a multi-state investigation, it concerned 5 people who had once shared a home in Summerfield, Florida. Casei Jones was 32 years old. She was the mother of 4 children: Cameron Bowers, Preston Bowers, Mercalli Jones, and Iona Jones. Cameron and Preston were her sons from a previous marriage. Mercalli and Iona were the daughters she shared with Michael Wayne Jones. Casei and Michael had married in 2017 and settled in Summerfield with the children. Cameron Bowers was 9 years old. His younger brother, Preston, was 4. Mercalli Jones was 2, and Iona Jones was only 11 months old. Some early reports described Cameron as 10, Preston as 5, and Iona as 1. Those differences appear to have resulted from rounded ages or birthdays near the period when the family was reported missing. For clarity, this account uses the ages recorded by the 5th Judicial Circuit State Attorney's Office for the children at the time of their deaths. Public records provide limited information about their everyday lives. There is no need to fill those gaps with imagined interests, conversations, or personality traits. Their ages alone reveal how dependent the children were on the adults around them. Cameron was still in elementary school age. Preston was only beginning his early childhood education. Mercalli was a toddler, and Iona had not yet reached her first birthday. The official record identifies Cameron and Preston as Casei's children from an earlier relationship, while Mercalli and Iona were the children of both Casei and Michael Jones. Together, the 6-member household lived in Marion County, where the older boys were expected to return to school after the summer break. For relatives outside the home, there was no immediate reason to believe that all 5 would soon disappear. Contact with Casei would later become irregular, but messages bearing her name continued to reach family members, creating the impression that she was still communicating. That impression would delay the questions that eventually brought law enforcement to the house. In July 2019, the family still appeared to be living together in Summerfield. But inside their home, something had already happened that the children did not understand. One evening in mid-July 2019, the course of life inside the Jones family's Summerfield home changed completely. What happened during the argument between Michael Wayne Jones and Casei Jones is known largely through the account Michael later gave investigators. No independent witness was present to confirm how the confrontation began, and the 4 children were not described in the court record as having seen the killing. According to Michael, he and Casei became involved in an argument that escalated into shouting. He claimed that Casei picked up a baseball bat. Michael said he took the bat away from her and then used it to kill her. That was his version of the confrontation. Casei could no longer provide her own account, and the documentary record should not present Michael's explanation as though every detail had been independently established. What is confirmed is that Casei died inside the home and that Michael later pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in connection with her death. Afterward, Michael wrapped Casei's remains in a shower curtain, placed them inside a plastic storage container and concealed the container in a back bedroom. Cameron, Preston, Mercalli, and Iona remained inside the house, unaware that their mother had been killed or that her remains were hidden only rooms away. From that moment, Casei was no longer the person communicating with relatives, answering her children's questions or explaining her absence. Michael now had to create a story convincing enough to account for why she could not be seen, reached by telephone or spoken to directly. The concealment inside the bedroom was only one part of that effort. Every ordinary question now carried a risk. Where was Casei? When was she returning? Why had no one heard her voice? What would happen when her children went back to school and began speaking to teachers, relatives, or other adults? For the moment, the children were still living under the same roof as Michael. They depended on him for food, transportation, and information about their mother. When they asked where she had gone, the only explanation available to them would come from the person responsible for her absence. Outside the house, relatives had not yet been given clear evidence that Casei was dead. Inside it, Michael had already begun controlling what others were allowed to know. The homicide had taken place, but the disappearance had not yet been reported. Before anyone began searching for Casei, Michael would attempt to make it appear that she had simply chosen to leave. Killing Casei had created a secret inside the house. Keeping that secret would soon place all 4 children in danger. In the days after Casei Jones was killed, Michael Wayne Jones faced an immediate problem. Her children expected their mother to return. Her relatives expected her to answer calls and messages. Any prolonged silence could bring someone to the Summerfield house, where Casei's remains were concealed inside a storage container in a back bedroom. Instead of reporting her death or contacting law enforcement, Michael began constructing an explanation for her absence. Shortly after the killing, he reached out to his former wife, Sarah. Michael attempted to renew their relationship and rebuild contact with the children they shared. He told Sarah that his marriage to Casei had ended and claimed that Casei had moved away to live closer to her mother. According to the Florida Supreme Court's account, that story allowed Michael to present himself as newly separated rather than as a husband whose wife had suddenly disappeared. The same explanation could not fully satisfy the 4 children still connected to the Summerfield home. Cameron Bowers and Preston Bowers were old enough to recognize that their mother had not returned. Mercalli Jones was only 2, and Iona Jones was still an infant, but all 4 remained dependent on Michael for information about where Casei had gone. When the children questioned him about their mother, Michael told them that he and Casei were taking a break. It was a simple explanation, familiar enough to delay further questions. The children had no way to confirm whether it was true, and the person giving them the answer controlled their access to anyone who might challenge it. Outside the house, Michael used another method to preserve the appearance that Casei was alive. He gained access to her communications and began impersonating her in text messages and on social media. Messages bearing Casei's identity continued reaching members of her extended family. Those communications created the impression that she had chosen to limit contact rather than being physically unable to communicate. The available court record does not provide the full wording of every message. For that reason, any on-screen text used in this documentary should be presented only as a paraphrased reconstruction and clearly labeled, "Reconstruction based on court records." No message should be written as a direct quotation unless its exact wording can be verified from an authenticated record. What mattered was not one dramatic message. It was the continued presence of Casei's name on relatives' phones and social media accounts. A digital response could delay a visit. It could explain why she did not answer a call. It could make relatives believe that she wanted distance, that she was occupied, or that she and Michael were handling a private marital separation. Each successful exchange gave Michael more time, but maintaining the deception required him to manage two different realities. To Sarah, he claimed that Casei had moved near her mother and that their relationship was over. To Casei's children, he said their parents were merely taking a break. To Casei's extended family, he communicated while pretending to be Casei herself. Those explanations did not have to remain convincing forever. They only had to prevent anyone from entering the house or insisting on speaking with Casei directly. Near the end of July, the pressure temporarily decreased. All 4 children left the Summerfield home for extended visits with family members. With Cameron, Preston, Mercalli, and Iona staying elsewhere, Michael faced fewer daily questions about their mother's location. The children were also away from the room where Casei had been concealed. For relatives, the visits may have made the situation appear less urgent. The children were visible and spending time with family. Messages still appeared to come from Casei. Michael continued presenting the household separation as an ordinary family matter. Yet the arrangement could not continue indefinitely. The older boys were approaching the beginning of a new school term. Their extended visits would end. They would return to Summerfield, where teachers and other adults could ask about Casei. Cameron and Preston could reveal that they had not seen their mother for weeks. They might repeat Michael's conflicting explanations or ask relatives to help them contact her. Once the children returned, the story Michael had created would become much harder to control. For a time, the children were away from the house and Jones's explanation remained largely unchallenged. But summer was ending, school was approaching, and the children would soon return. In August 2019, only days before the new school term was scheduled to begin, Michael Wayne Jones collected Cameron Bowers, Preston Bowers, Mercalli Jones, and Iona Jones from their extended visits with relatives. He brought all 4 children back to the Summerfield house where their mother, Casei Jones, had already been killed and concealed. For several weeks, Jones had controlled the explanation for Casei's absence. He told the children that he and their mother were taking a break. He told others that Casei had moved closer to her mother. Through texts and social media accounts, he continued communicating in Casei's name. The return of the children created a problem that digital messages could not solve. Cameron was 9 years old. Preston was 4. With school approaching, the boys would soon be in regular contact with teachers, classmates, relatives, and other adults outside the home. According to the account Jones later gave police, he became concerned that Cameron and Preston might reveal that they had not seen their mother for weeks. In his confession, he connected that concern directly to the approaching school term. Jones still had several opportunities to end what he had begun. He could have contacted law enforcement. He could have told a relative what had happened to Casei. He could have left the children with people capable of protecting them. Weeks had passed since Casei's death. The concealment was no longer connected to a single confrontation. It had been maintained through repeated choices, changing explanations, and messages sent while pretending to be someone who could no longer speak for herself. Rather than expose the truth, Jones acted against the children he believed might reveal it. The Florida Supreme Court's account states that Jones killed Cameron first. He entered the room while the 9-year-old was asleep and strangled him. Jones then placed Cameron's body inside a suitcase and left it in the bedroom the two boys shared. The following day, Preston asked where his older brother was. There was another interval in which Jones could have stopped. Cameron was dead, but Preston, Mercalli and Iona were still alive. Jones could have called for help, surrendered to police, or placed the surviving children in the care of relatives. He did none of those things. That night, Jones killed 4-year-old Preston by drowning him in the bathtub after placing a large zip tie around his neck. He later moved Preston's body into a storage container. These details are stated only once to establish the legally documented sequence and method of death. The time between the two killings is important. Cameron and Preston were not killed during one continuous confrontation. Cameron was killed first. A day passed. Preston asked about him. Jones then made another decision. The children depended on Jones for food, transportation, shelter, and information about their mother. He controlled the house, their movement, and the explanations reaching people outside it. They had no meaningful way to verify what he was telling them or remove themselves from his control. After killing the boys, Jones took additional steps to hide what had happened. The court record states that he wrapped the containers in plastic to suppress the odor and spread cat litter over areas stained by bodily fluids. He then continued living in the house with his two daughters while Casei, Cameron, and Preston remained concealed inside. Mercalli was 2 years old. Iona was 11 months old. Neither child could leave the home without the assistance of the adult responsible for protecting them. 3 members of the family were now dead. But Mercalli and Iona were still alive inside the house, and another deadline was approaching. Near the end of August 2019, Michael Wayne Jones was still living inside the Summerfield house with his 2 youngest daughters, Mercalli Jones and Iona Jones. Casei Jones had already been killed and concealed in a plastic storage container in a back bedroom. 9-year-old Cameron Bowers and 4-year-old Preston Bowers had also been killed and hidden inside the home. Jones had attempted to reduce the signs of what had happened by spreading cat litter over stained flooring and wrapping the containers in plastic to suppress the odor. Mercalli was 2 years old. Iona was 11 months old. They were now the only members of the household, apart from Jones, who was still alive. The concealment depended on one condition. No outsider could be allowed to enter the property and see what Jones had left there. Then, near the end of August, Jones received an eviction notice. The notice placed a deadline on the deception. The house could no longer remain closed indefinitely. An eviction meant that the property would have to be vacated and that other people could soon gain access. The remains of Casei, Cameron, and Preston were still inside. Mercalli and Iona were there with Jones. Whatever explanation he had maintained through messages could not prevent the house itself from being examined. The day before the scheduled eviction, Jones killed Mercalli and Iona. The Florida Supreme Court's account states that he carried 2-year-old Mercalli to the bathroom and drowned her in the bathtub. He then returned for Iona and killed her in the same manner. Both children were entirely dependent on the adult who controlled the home, their movement, and their contact with the outside world. Jones placed the girls in separate bags and then put them together inside one storage container. At that point, 5 victims were concealed inside the house: Casei Jones, Cameron Bowers, Preston Bowers, Mercalli Jones, and Iona Jones. The eviction deadline had not forced Jones to admit what had happened. Instead, it prompted him to move the evidence. He transferred all 5 victims into Casei's minivan. Then he drove away from Summerfield and traveled to Jacksonville, where he stayed with his former wife, Sarah. He told her that he and Casei had separated. He also claimed that the children were with Casei. That explanation reversed the reality inside the van. Casei was not caring for the children somewhere else. All 5 members of the family had been placed inside the vehicle Jones drove to Jacksonville. The move gave him distance from the Summerfield house, but it created a new danger. The minivan now carried evidence of every death. Jones had not simply left the family home after the killings. He had used Casei's own minivan to transport her and all 4 children to another Florida city. He then stayed there while continuing to present the family as alive and separated. The sequence also shows how the crimes unfolded over time. Casei had been killed in July. Cameron and Preston were killed on separate days after returning home in August. Mercalli and Iona remained alive until the eviction date threatened to expose what was inside the property. At several points, Jones could have contacted police, surrendered, or placed the surviving children with relatives. Each time, he chose concealment instead. Casei had been dead since July. The 4 children had been killed at different times in August. Their relatives were still receiving communications that appeared to come from Casei. And now all 5 victims had been moved from the family home into her minivan. The move to Jacksonville did not end the deception. According to the court record, Jones continued impersonating Casei in text messages for almost 2 more weeks. For relatives receiving those communications, the family's absence still appeared to have an explanation. But the longer Casei remained unavailable for a direct conversation, the harder that explanation became to accept. The family had vanished from Summerfield, but the messages from Casei's account continued. After leaving Summerfield, Michael Wayne Jones stayed in Jacksonville with his former wife, Sarah. The 5 victims remained concealed inside Casei Jones's minivan, while Jones continued presenting the family's disappearance as an ordinary separation. To Sarah, he maintained that he and Casei were no longer together and that Casei had the children. To members of Casei's extended family, messages still appeared to come from Casei herself. The communication gave Jones a way to answer questions without allowing anyone to hear Casei's voice, see her in person, or confirm where the children were. According to the Florida Supreme Court, Jones maintained this deception for almost 2 more weeks after transporting the victims to Jacksonville. During that period, he continued impersonating Casei in text messages. The messages created proof of activity, but not proof of safety. A reply could appear on a screen while every attempt at normal contact remained unanswered. The contradictions were becoming harder to ignore. Jones had previously claimed that Casei had moved to live near her mother. Yet her family could not communicate with her in the ordinary way. The 4 children were said to be with Casei, but relatives had not recently seen them. Messages continued arriving under Casei's identity, but there were no direct conversations in which family members could hear her voice and ask where she and the children were. There was also the minivan. The vehicle belonged to Casei, yet Jones had driven it away from Summerfield and taken it to Jacksonville. The relatives receiving messages in Casei's name did not know that the vehicle had become the place where all 5 victims were concealed. To them, it was simply another missing part of a story that no longer fit together. The title of this documentary requires an important clarification. Court records do not establish that Jones was continuously driving for several weeks. They establish that he loaded the 5 victims into Casei's minivan, drove them from Summerfield to Jacksonville, and maintained the false account for almost 2 more weeks before later fleeing north. The vehicle remained central to the concealment, even while it was not moving. That distinction does not reduce the scale of what investigators would eventually uncover. It explains how the disappearance was prolonged. Jones did not need to convince every relative that nothing was wrong. He needed to delay them, to provide enough digital contact, enough explanation, and enough uncertainty to prevent an immediate visit or report to law enforcement. But digital communication had limits. Family members knew how Casei normally communicated. They could recognize when contact had become irregular, when explanations failed to remain consistent, and when messages were being used in place of a direct conversation. As the days passed, the communications linked to Casei no longer reassured the people who knew her. Their irregularity became another reason for concern. The Florida Supreme Court records that her family eventually grew suspicious and that, by mid-September, her mother was prepared to ask law enforcement to intervene. Casei's mother could not confirm where her daughter was. No relative could independently verify that the 4 children were safe. The explanations had continued, but the family remained unseen. Eventually, Casei's mother stopped accepting digital messages as proof that her daughter was safe. By mid-September 2019, messages carrying Casei Jones's name were no longer enough to reassure her family. Almost 6 weeks had passed since relatives had last seen Casei and her 4 children. Cameron Bowers, Preston Bowers, Casei Jones, and Iona Jones had missed the normal contact their family expected. Calls were not producing direct conversations. No one could independently confirm where the children were, and the explanations reaching relatives through Casei's accounts had become increasingly difficult to accept. On September 14th, Casei's mother contacted the Marion County Sheriff's Office. She reported Casei and the 4 children missing and requested that officers conduct a wellness check at the family's home in Summerfield, Florida. Contemporary reporting stated that the family had last been seen in the Ocala area in early August. Until that call, Michael Wayne Jones had controlled nearly every explanation surrounding the family's absence. He had impersonated Casei through text messages and social media. He had claimed that their marriage had ended and that she was living near her mother. He had told his former wife that Casei had the children. The wellness check introduced something he could no longer control: an investigator entering the house. A Marion County detective traveled to the Summerfield property. By then, Jones had already moved Casei and the children into her minivan and driven them to Jacksonville. The house appeared empty, but the steps Jones had taken inside it had left signs that could not be removed through a digital message. When the detective entered, he noticed a strong odor. According to the Florida Supreme Court's account, the detective believed that it was a combination of decomposition and bleach. The observation immediately changed the purpose of the visit. Officers were no longer simply trying to locate a woman who had stopped communicating normally. They now had reason to consider whether a serious crime had occurred inside the home. Investigators did not treat the odor alone as permission to conduct an unlimited search. They obtained a warrant before securing physical evidence from the property. The Florida Supreme Court's published decision does not list every item recovered during that search, so this documentary should not invent a detailed catalogue of evidence. What the ruling confirms is that officers found physical evidence connected to what had occurred inside the house. The investigation was now moving in 2 directions. One part focused on the Summerfield home and the evidence found there. The other focused on locating Casei, the children, and the vehicle that should have been connected to them. Authorities learned that Casei's minivan was missing from the property. That vehicle mattered because it provided a possible means of travel. If Casei had left voluntarily with the children, the minivan might reveal where they had gone. If someone else was using it, the vehicle could lead investigators to the last person who had contact with them. Law enforcement issued a be on the lookout notice for Casei Jones, Cameron Bowers, Preston Bowers, Casei Jones, Iona Jones, and the minivan. The concern was no longer limited to relatives who could not reach them. Their names and vehicle information were now part of an active law enforcement search. On-screen timeline. Early August 2019, Casei and the 4 children were last reported seen in the Ocala area. Following weeks, messages continued appearing from Casei's accounts, but relatives could not speak with her normally or confirm that the children were safe. September 14th, 2019, Casei's family reported her and the children missing to the Marion County Sheriff's Office. Mid-September, a detective conducted a wellness check, noticed the odor inside the Summerfield house, and investigators obtained a search warrant. After the search, authorities issued an alert for the 5 missing family members and Casei's minivan. For the first time, the explanations Michael had maintained were being tested against physical evidence. A message could be sent from almost anywhere. A social media account could be accessed by someone other than its owner. But the Summerfield house contained indications that Casei's disappearance was not the result of an ordinary separation. Investigators still did not know that all 5 victims had been transported in the missing minivan. They did not yet know where Michael Jones had taken the vehicle, or whether any member of the family might still be found alive. To answer those questions, police began identifying the people who had recently communicated with Jones. That search led them to his former wife, Sarah, the woman with whom he had been staying in Jacksonville. Investigators believed she might have information about Michael, Casei, and the children. When they contacted her, she described a recent encounter that appeared to place the entire family together and alive. For a brief moment, that account offered a possible explanation for the disappearance. But it was false. Police were now searching for 5 missing people and the vehicle registered to the missing mother. But Jones was about to provide investigators with another explanation, one supported by a witness who was not telling the truth. As investigators examined the Summerfield house and searched for Casei Jones, her 4 children and the missing minivan, they began tracing Michael Wayne Jones's recent contacts. That process led them to his former wife, identified in the Florida Supreme Court record as Sarah. Michael had been staying with Sarah in Jacksonville after leaving the Summerfield property. He had told her that his marriage to Casei had ended and that Casei had taken Cameron, Preston, Mercalli, and Iona with her. Sarah had not been told that all 5 members of the family were concealed inside the minivan Michael had brought to Jacksonville. When law enforcement contacted Sarah by telephone, Michael was present and directing what she should say. Sarah told investigators that she had recently seen Michael, Casei, and the 4 children together at a McDonald's in Palatka, Florida. According to her account, the entire family had been alive only a few days earlier. For officers searching for 5 missing people, the reported sighting was significant. If it were true, it would place Casei and the children outside Summerfield after the period when relatives had last seen them. It could also suggest that the family had left voluntarily and that the disturbing evidence inside the house had another explanation. But the McDonald's meeting had never happened. Sarah later admitted that her statement to police was false. The Florida Supreme Court record establishes that Michael had directed her during the call. It does not establish that she participated in the killings or knew that the victims were inside the minivan, and no broader role should be assigned to her without evidence. The false sighting nevertheless gave Michael something he urgently needed: additional time. Investigators now had to consider a claimed observation of the family in Palatka while also examining evidence from the Summerfield residence. The 2 accounts could not easily be reconciled. One suggested that Casei and the children had recently been alive. The other indicated that something serious had occurred inside their home. Sarah eventually stopped supporting Michael's explanation. As the pressure surrounding the missing family investigation increased, she confronted him. According to the court record, she told Michael that something was clearly wrong and that he needed to speak with police. Michael did not contact law enforcement. Instead, he left Jacksonville in Casei's minivan and drove north, away from the officers searching for the vehicle and the 5 people connected to it. At that moment, all 5 victims were still concealed inside the van. Once Michael crossed from Florida into Georgia, he stopped in a heavily wooded area. There, he removed the containers holding Cameron Bowers, Preston Bowers, Mercalli Jones, and Iona Jones. He left the 4 children in the woods and returned to the road. Casei remained inside the minivan. The decision separated the family for the first time since Michael had moved them from the Summerfield house. The children were now concealed in an isolated outdoor location, while their mother continued north in the vehicle registered in her name. Investigators in Florida were still searching for the entire family together. They did not yet know that Michael had crossed into Georgia or that the children had been removed from the van. The false McDonald's account had already complicated the timeline, and the vehicle could now have been traveling toward any number of destinations. Every mile increased the distance between the physical evidence in Florida, the children left in Georgia, and the minivan carrying Casei. Michael continued north. He had not surrendered, and he had not contacted the officers who were trying to locate him. Had the journey continued without interruption, authorities might have been forced to expand the search into additional states while attempting to determine where the family had last been together. But the minivan did not remain on the highway. Before Michael could travel much farther, the vehicle ran off the road and struck a culvert. The crash brought a Georgia deputy to the scene and placed law enforcement within feet of the evidence hidden inside the van. The investigation had begun with relatives questioning messages sent in Casei's name. It had progressed through an empty house, a missing vehicle, and a fabricated sighting at a fast food restaurant. Now, an ordinary traffic response was about to expose the truth. Had Jones continued driving, the search might have expanded across several states. Instead, the journey ended because the minivan left the road. The search returned to Georgia, where Michael Wayne Jones's journey ended without warning. The minivan left the road and struck a culvert. Deputy Wade Bennett was sent to the crash scene. What he encountered initially required the familiar work of identifying the driver, assessing the vehicle, and determining why it had left the roadway. But as Bennett approached the damaged van, he noticed the odor of decomposition coming from inside. When Bennett asked Jones what he was doing in Georgia, Jones did not offer another story about a separation or a family trip. He volunteered that the odor was coming from his dead wife and said that he had killed her. Bennett then asked whether Jones had children. Jones said that he did, but claimed they were staying with their grandmother. That answer continued the deception even after Casei Jones had been discovered. Cameron Bowers, Preston Bowers, Mercalli Jones, and Iona Jones were not with their grandmother. Their containers had been removed from the minivan and left in a heavily wooded area after Jones crossed into Georgia. Deputy Bennett took Jones to a Georgia jail for questioning. There, the account that had been maintained through false messages, conflicting explanations, and a fabricated sighting began to collapse. Jones confessed to killing Casei and all 4 children. He provided investigators with a detailed account of the events and agreed to lead law enforcement to the place where he had left the children. Officers followed his directions into the wooded area. There, they recovered the remains of 4 children. A Georgia medical examiner later confirmed their identities as Cameron, Preston, Mercalli, and Iona. The missing person search had reached its conclusion, but it had not produced the outcome Casei's relatives had hoped for. No member of the family was found alive. The crash had not prevented the killings. It had only stopped Jones's flight and brought officers close enough to uncover what he had concealed. Jones was later transferred to a nearby sheriff's office, where a detective from Marion County interviewed him. During that interview, he described the killings of the children and was questioned about why he had committed them. His responses would later become part of the evidence considered as prosecutors prepared the case against him. The roadside discovery connected the separate parts of the investigation: the physical evidence in Summerfield, the messages sent in Casei's name, the missing minivan, the false McDonald's sighting, and the 4 children left in Georgia. Investigators now knew where the family was. The remaining questions concerned how the crimes would be prosecuted, and whether Jones's explanation for his actions would affect his punishment. After Michael Wayne Jones was returned to Florida, the case moved from a missing family investigation into a prosecution involving 5 separate deaths. A Marion County grand jury indicted Jones on 4 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Cameron Bowers, Preston Bowers, Mercalli Jones, and Iona Jones. He was also indicted on 1 count of second-degree murder for the death of Casei Jones. The state of Florida announced that it would seek the death penalty for each of the 4 first-degree murder charges. Jones later pleaded guilty to all 5 counts. There would be no guilt phase trial to determine whether he had committed the killings. Instead, the court questioned him about the charges, the rights he was giving up, and the possible consequences of his decision before accepting the pleas. Years later, the Florida Supreme Court independently reviewed that process. The justices concluded that Jones had entered his pleas knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily. Their decision noted that he had made incriminating statements when he was arrested, confessed during 2 recorded interviews, and faced physical evidence and witness testimony that strongly supported the prosecution's case. The next phase concerned punishment. For the murders of the 4 children, prosecutors presented 6 aggravating circumstances for each count. They argued, among other points, that the victims were younger than 12, that Jones occupied a position of familial authority, and that the killings were committed to prevent discovery and lawful arrest. The trial court ultimately found that all 6 aggravating factors had been proved. The defense asked the jury to consider evidence concerning Jones's mental condition. Dr. Harold Burston testified that Jones's reported delusions and hallucinations were consistent with a schizoaffective spectrum illness. Dr. Stephen Nelson diagnosed a neurodevelopmental disorder that, in his opinion, could make Jones more vulnerable to psychosis. Dr. John Fabian diagnosed major depressive disorder with psychotic features and stated that Jones experienced a psychotic break after Casei's death. Those were opinions presented by defense experts during the penalty phase. They did not change Jones's guilty pleas, and they should not be treated as conclusions reached by this documentary. The jury was required to weigh that testimony against the circumstances surrounding each child's death. After deliberating for almost 5 hours, the 12-member jury unanimously recommended death for all 4 first-degree murder counts. The trial judge followed that recommendation and imposed 4 death sentences. Jones also received a life sentence for Casei's second-degree murder. Jones appealed. He challenged the jury instructions and Florida's capital sentencing system, while the Supreme Court also reviewed the validity of his guilty pleas. On July 10, 2025, the Florida Supreme Court rejected his arguments and affirmed all 4 first-degree murder convictions and death sentences. As of this documentary's research, that decision remains the latest verified appellate ruling in the case. The legal process determined Jones's punishment, but a sentence could not restore the 5 lives erased from one family. Casei Jones, Cameron Bowers, Preston Bowers, Mercalli Jones, Iona Jones. This case is often remembered because of what Deputy Wade Bennett discovered inside a damaged minivan on a Georgia roadside. But the vehicle, the crash, and the investigation should never become more important than the 5 people whose lives were taken. Casei was 32. Cameron was 9. Preston was 4. Mercalli was 2. Iona was only 11 months old. The investigation began because Casei's family recognized that messages were not the same as hearing her voice or seeing her safe. Their insistence on a wellness check exposed a deception that had continued for weeks. By then, however, the opportunity to save Casei and the children had already passed. The accidental crash ended Michael Wayne Jones's flight. It connected investigators to the missing minivan and ultimately led them to all 5 victims. But solving the case could only reveal what had happened. It could not return the family to those who had been searching for them. Which development ultimately broke the deception? The family suspicion, the evidence inside the house, or the accidental crash in Georgia? Subscribe for carefully researched true crime documentaries that follow the evidence while keeping victims at the center of the story.